Case law, Balfour vs. Balfour, explanation using IRAC method. Welcome. Today, we'll explore a key contract law case, Balfour vs. Balfour, 1919, which helped define the difference between domestic agreements and legally binding contracts. Let's begin with the central legal issue. Can a promise between spouses be considered a legally binding contract? Let's examine the facts to understand the court's decision. Background, scene opens in a cozy home. Mr. and Mrs. Balfour together, looking happy. Mr. and Mrs. Balfour were a married couple living in England. Mr. Balfour worked overseas in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, as a government employee. The couple returned to England for a holiday, and during this time, Mrs. Balfour developed rheumatism.
Mrs. Balfour said, coughing slightly, holding her arm in pain, "The doctor says I need to stay in England to recover. The humid climate in Ceylon may worsen my condition."
Mr. Balfour said, "I understand. I must return to work, but don't worry, I will send you £30 a month for your expenses." Mr. Balfour takes her hand reassuringly before leaving. However, as time passed, their relationship deteriorated. Mr. Balfour stopped sending the money, leading Mrs. Balfour to sue him for breach of contract. What is the issue in this case? Cutting to a courtroom setting. The judge sits at a desk with a gavel, and Mrs. Balfour sits on the witness stand. The key legal question in this case was Mr. Balfour legally obligated to continue paying Mrs. Balfour? Judge said, "Mrs. Balfour, please state your claim."
"Your Honor, my husband promised to send me £30 a month for my support. When he failed to do so, I had no choice but to bring this matter before the court. A promise is a promise, and I believe he is legally bound to fulfill it."
What is the rule in this case? The judge nods thoughtfully and turns to the courtroom. Judge, in contract law, for an agreement to be legally binding, there must be an intention to create legal relations. Social and domestic agreements, such as those between family members, are usually not legally enforceable unless there is clear evidence of contractual intent. The court considered previous cases and determined that agreements between spouses typically fall into the category of social arrangements rather than enforceable contracts. What is the application in this case? Mrs. Balfour appears frustrated in court.
"But he made a clear promise. Why should I suffer because of his broken word?"
Mr. Balfour said, "Your Honor, it was a private matter between us as husband and wife. It was never intended to be a formal contract."
Judge, indeed, this court finds that there was no mutual intent to create a legally binding agreement. In domestic settings, couples make many informal promises, but the law does not enforce all of them. Cut to the judge addressing the courtroom. Judge, to rule otherwise would mean that courts would have to interfere in every minor dispute between married couples, which is not the purpose of contract law. What is the conclusion in this case? Judge raises gavel. Judge, verdict, the agreement was purely domestic and lacked legal intent. The claim is dismissed. Mrs. Balfour sighs in disappointment while Mr. Balfour looks relieved. Thus, in Balfour vs. Balfour, the court ruled that domestic agreements do not usually have legal standing unless there is a clear intention to create a legally enforceable contract. If you make an agreement with a family member, it isn't necessarily a contract unless both parties intend it to be legally binding. That's why agreements between businesses or strangers are treated differently than those between family members. So, what did we learn from Balfour vs. Balfour? Issue: can a husband's promise to financially support his wife be legally enforced? Rule: for a contract to be binding, there must be an intention to create legal relations. Application: domestic agreements are not contracts unless explicitly intended. Conclusion: the court ruled in favor of Mr. Balfour, stating that his promise was a personal agreement, not a contract. The Balfour vs. Balfour case remains fundamental in contract law, helping courts decide when an agreement is legally binding. Always remember, just because a promise is made doesn't mean the law will enforce it. And that concludes our explanation of Balfour versus Balfour using the IRAC method. We hope you enjoyed our video and learned something valuable about contract law. Thanks for watching this courtroom drama. Stay tuned for more fascinating legal cases in action.